welcome to another exciting edition of The Writer's Dream. This is a show where authors can talk about how they write their books, how they publish, and how they market their books. You can find us on Facebook. The name of the Facebook page is, guess what? The Writer's Dream. You can find us on Cablevision. We are on channel 115 at 2:30 on Thursdays. I've interviewed about 150 authors, so you can find us on YouTube. Just look for my name, Linda Maria Frank, and click on my picture and you will get all of the videos. If you want to be on The Writer's Dream, please message me through the Facebook page, The Writer's Dream. Without further ado, let me introduce our guest today, who's Amy Hunt, who has written a book on the edge. Amy is a retired attorney and 7th grade social studies history teacher. So Amy, welcome.
Thank you. And I just,
Tell us about yourself.
Amy Turner is my name. And yes, I retired from 2 professions, and writing is now my 3rd. I was first an attorney, and then made the switch at 48, which was a little old to be making that switch, but I was
Never too old.
Never too old, exactly. So I was very fortunate, was able to get a job in a great school locally. It didn't have a long commute, so I did that for about 14 years. And actually, while I was teaching, I also started this book on the ledge. I have lived in East Hampton for about 30 years, and my husband and I raised 2 sons here who are now off living elsewhere.
Wow. So, On the Edge, the title of the book really starts the story. So tell us, can you sum up the story for us?
Sure. Actually, this story is my recovery from an accident. I was crossing a street in a crosswalk in July 2010 on a Saturday in the village of East Hampton, and I was plowed into, mowed down by a pickup truck. And amazingly, I had no broken bones or internal injuries, but there was definitely a recovery period. During that recovery period, I find myself actually recovering from much more deeply buried trauma, and that was when I was 4.5. My father climbed out of the ledge of his hotel window. He was on a business trip to New Haven and threatened to jump. He was persuaded to come inside by a priest, and he was then hospitalized for close to a year. As I say, I was 4.5. I wasn't aware of it at the time. I learned the family secret when I was 16. But ironically, images of him on the ledge appeared in more than 80 newspapers across the country,
Was your father
including
famous?
the Daily News. No, he wasn't at all. All I can think of is that the images were just so dramatic that somehow a photographer for the New Haven Register had taken these photos and they went out over the wires. And so these, newspapers from local to the LA Times, subscribing to the wires, picked them up and decided to publish them.
So, so your father was suffering from depression, I'm assuming.
Yes, he had been suffering from depression and really intense anxiety. He kind of had a strange kind of suicide attempt, cry for help before that. But his psychoanalyst thought he was doing quite well, and my mother was pretty confident. He went off on this business trip, and don't think anyone really knows what happened exactly, but he was probably overcome with anxiety and panic and climbed out onto the ledge.
Right. He lost his connections with your mother, you, and his, I guess, his psychological support team.
Yes.
I guess that's, in those days, that was, I guess, more important than drugs taken or...
Well,
it probably still is.
I think he must have had some kind of manic episode at the time. And probably another reason why the images were so compelling was that it just turned out that a priest was passing by, actually 3 of them, just by chance, and they ran over to see what the commotion was. One stayed on the sidewalk in case last rites were necessary. One went up to his hotel room, and actually 2 priests went up, and the head priest said, "Why don't you see what you can do?" to the younger priest, and he talked to my father for 20 minutes, and eventually my father came inside, and then he was taken to the hospital. So the pictures of the priest in the window with my father on the ledge.
Very dramatic.
Yeah, very dramatic.
It's like National Geographic will pick a particular picture and broadcast it all over the world.
Yes, absolutely.
So when your father was in the hospital for that year,
yes,
you were totally dependent on your mother.
Mm-hmm.
And from what I read in the book, your mother had her own issues.
Yes, she absolutely did. She was an active alcoholic at the time with 4 children. My sister was...
That'll drive you to drink to begin
Yes,
with.
exactly. So she had her hands full to begin with. She had 3 children under 3. She's, within 3 years, the 3 of us, and then my sister was about 5 years older. But she was on her own. It was an unbelievable shock, of course, and I had no idea if and when he was coming home.
Yeah.
So really, and as a reflection of her courage and her strength, and I guess we'd just say grace, because she managed to get sober 2 months later.
Wow.
And had remained sober till the day she died, and that eventually got easier, but those first couple of years were tough. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Yes, I have had some experience with alcoholics, and that period of them first getting sober. It's like if you smoked and you're first getting off the cigarettes, it's...
Yes, I have experience with that.
Me too. So, but you really, I guess it's dint of will. So, what were your memories like, though? You were only 4.5. What were your memories like?
Well, I didn't have... my first very clear memory of my father, actually, again, ironically, was on another ledge. At some point, it might have been 8 months after he, from my perspective, disappeared. We saw him again, and he was in our local hospital, I think as a halfway mark to coming home. And we were going to go, I thought we were going to visit him, but it turned out we were just parking across from the balcony outside his window, and he came out and waved to us. So I say in the book, my brother and I were just overjoyed that we were going to get to see him. But when it became apparent that we weren't actually going to be in his presence and he wasn't coming home, I was, struck with such sadness. So it was a very early on that experience that with any kind of joy in our family, there's always an undercurrent of sadness. So I remember that quite well. And it turned out I was sick a lot that year too, which I think maybe was a reflection of my sadness. And children, as I say, I didn't have the facts, so you make up your own story. And for a while I heard hospital, I thought, well, he's becoming a doctor now, or maybe he's having a knee operation. But when I got home, even though I wasn't told till I was 16, it was very clear something was wrong. My mother was very nervous about his mental state. So we were all, I think people are now familiar with the term hypervigilant, I was constantly observing myself, monitoring myself. Am I making a mistake that might get him upset? That leads to a lot of anxiety.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, definitely. So what was it about being in the accident? Because you describe it minute by minute so very well of what it's like to go through a traumatic experience. Because really, from my perspective, I never had anything as traumatic as that, but the ones that I've had, time slows down and everything is happening in a very slow motion, and you're experiencing every feeling and observing things that you ordinarily wouldn't, and it's a very weird situation. So what was it about going through that and then going home and recovering that brought all this to the surface?
Well, yes, time as you say, time does slow down. And just from a craft perspective, when I was writing that scene, it was in slow motion in my head, so I could write, just every sort of second, every nuance of it. But the scene was going very slowly, and of course it all happened really quickly. So there had to be a balance between getting all the detail in, but the reader also realizing, see the truck, oh my God, he's hitting me. Whereas it felt like, 10 minutes went by. So it was obviously, an extremely random, shocking event because there was no traffic. It was a quiet moment. It really
Shouldn't have happened.
Shouldn't have happened. It was so surprising. So I was left with this feeling of, why did this happen? How could this have happened?
And was it your fault?
Was it my fault? Yes. Did I invite that truck? And in the moment when the truck hit me, and I mentioned this in the book, there was this feeling of relief in a way. I knew I was face to face with it. I knew it was hitting me. I knew this could be it, but something about me just let go. And I think on some very deep level, it felt like a relief from everything I'd been carrying all my life. But I think had I just had the accident, I don't know if this book would have come out of it. But a couple of months later, my brother died. He was 13 months younger. And in it was also random and shocking because he'd been doing better than he'd been doing in decades. We all expected, now Harold's doing really well. He's going to be fine. Whereas 10 years before, I wouldn't have been surprised.
Did he suffer from depression as well?
Alcoholism. So he had been sober for 3 years, first time in 20 years. So I had stopped worrying about him. He just dies in his sleep. So that was less than 2 months later. So these two random events happening in such quick succession really, really unsettled me. And I kept thinking, what is going on? How are these things related? And long answer, but in about 8 months later, we had a memorial for him, and I started writing a thank you note to our English teacher who had attended. She knew my acupuncturist who was treating me for the accident. And as I started writing, this channel just opened up inside me that I'd never before had access to. And all these connections, memories, insights came pouring out, sent off the thank you note, and realized, it just kept coming. And after about 30 pages, I wondered, is this a diary entry? Or am I actually doing something? Showed it to a few people who, editor and a professor, and they said, no, this sounds like a memoir. I thought, I better learn what I'm doing with respect to a memoir, and I kept writing. So it was the confluence of those two events, I think, that unlocked something. And then I'll just say briefly, I do think in the end it was coming to terms with vulnerability that I felt as a child, that my father must have felt on the ledge, that I felt in front of the truck, and somehow that feeling of vulnerability.
And your brother dying.
And my brother dying.
Yeah.
When we were really so close in age, it was 13 months. We were almost born together. So I think that was probably the underlying force. Yeah.
Force. It's a good word. Yeah, that made you write this story. And I think so many people can relate to this. There are so many people whose families have various issues. Senator Fetterman coming forth about his bout with depression, I think, is so important.
Yes,
and he's so gentle about talking about it, which I think is what people need to hear these messages.
Yeah.
And what always disturbs me about all of this is that it takes us so long to put it all together.
Mm-hmm. Well, I feel very grateful, that I had always wanted to write and had been very blocked, and I'd given up on that as a dream, but I'd had 2 careers and family, so I made, I came to, made my peace with that. So this feels like, an utter, a gift really, for myself to have been able to
Well, I
to write
think
it.
I think to be a writer, I'm going to ask you first before I say what.
Yes.
What makes a writer? What made you the writer?
Um,
You kind
I-
of said it already. But
yes. Well, I honestly, I think anyone can be. And I think a lot of us start something, but for, 1,000 reasons and as many reasons as there are people who do start to write, we hit obstacles, something discourages us and we give up. So part of being a writer, I think, is just persistence because it's not easy. At certain points it's very difficult. So I think it's persistence, a need to express something. And I think that need has to be strong enough that it outweighs all the things that might prevent you from moving forward. And in my case, I really did feel this imperative that I didn't quite understand. I'm not, there are many other things that I wouldn't consider myself persistent at. I'll give up. But so the need to express, the persistence, and then of course you have to learn something about craft and work at it.
I think a writer is a person, I'm going to say it the same thing you're saying differently, has a passionate need to tell a story.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a story and you really want to tell it, and my books are mystery stories for kids, they're total fiction, fantasy, whatever you want to call them. But I love to tell a story. What I enjoyed most when I taught was making up stories about things. And so I said, I'm just going to do this. I'm going to write this down. But you have to have the passion. You have to have, as you said, you have to have the persistence because writing is hard work.
It is really hard.
People think it's but it's not. It's hard work to find the right words to say what you want to say.
And it's, that part of it can be extremely, sometimes it flows, like for me in the beginning, but then of course, eventually it doesn't flow anymore. And it's, does get to be much harder. And then even as I learned, and I really didn't know, once you do think that you've got a pretty good draft, you go through 30 more, or however many, pick a number. The amount of revision, line by line, and changing structure and so forth.
But that's the writing process.
It's the writing process.
It's the writing process.
Yeah.
And I also think that you're being a teacher, you are a storyteller, especially a history teacher.
Yes, yes, and story is really the way we learn, right? Going back to, pre-writing, sitting around the fire telling stories, and that is, as you were saying, that's how students like to learn best.
Yeah, I do a series of lectures, and one of them I start with the line of civilizations are defined by their stories.
And we are as individuals, and I think for me, because of these two events, and my history of my father and so forth, I'd had a lot of therapy. I needed to figure out what my story was. I couldn't leave these two things as just random outlier events in a life. I had to find a way, not find a way, but explore it enough to see how they are part of the whole, where...
Sure, the connection.
Integrating them. And I think that was part of that imperative I felt.
Yeah, and I think you did that very well, and it kind of defines your personality. And sometimes that personality that we develop as a child needs help.
Yes, I mean, I was, very fortunate. I had a lot of therapy. It was extremely helpful, but as a result of the accident, I ended up having somatic, other modalities that involve the nervous system, which is are designed to resolve the aftermath of trauma. And it was just by chance I ended up with somebody who was doing that. And that was really helpful. Helped me to get to the sort of residue in my system that was beyond words, that somehow it couldn't be expressed in words, but was in my nervous system. So that was, I was very lucky to have found myself there.
I commend you for doing it, and I want to read one of your reviews.
Oh, thank you.
On the Ledge is an extraordinary memoir of the way trauma harms both body and soul. Amy Turner's near miss with death at the age of 57 propels her on a journey back through family history, lending to a new understanding of how her father's attempted suicide and her mother's determination to move on has shaped and limited her since the age of 4. Inspirational and beautifully told. And this is Susan Scarf Merrill, author of Shirley, a Novel.
Yes, and I thank you for sharing that. And I just have to say that Susan Merrill's book, Shirley, which was made into a major motion picture with Elizabeth Moss, is a wonderful, wonderful novel. So
yeah, well,
people have a treat.
I think it's important, I think, for humans to share their stories.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what makes us cohesive. What makes us feel connected and cared about.
Yes.
And in this day and age when everybody is disconnected by a phone,
Right.
and I say disconnected by a phone.
Yes, exactly.
These stories are very important. So how did you publish?
Well, can I just add one?
Oh,
when you were
sure,
saying the
absolutely.
importance of sharing story, I didn't expect this. I don't know why, but I've heard from so many people who've shared with me that they had a secret in their family, that people didn't talk about it, that it helped them to read this book because I was sharing secrets, and they took something away from some feeling of solace or support or so forth. So that's been really, really nice. And I should add too that there's humor in the book too for anybody who.
Yes, I enjoyed the humor. Where does the humor come from?
Well, that's my personality, and I've always used humor as a defense mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
And I did it, when I was hit by the truck almost immediately. And of course, it was because it's part of me. It was in my manuscript, and I have to say, at certain points, it was pointed out to me that I was using it as a defense mechanism in my writing. People would say, Amy, you're cracking a joke here, but I think there's something else. And sure enough, so I had to go back, and some of the humor is, endemic to the story and germane. Others, were defense mechanisms. So I had to get rid of that and see what was actually what I really wanted to say. So
yeah, well, that's
dig a little deeper.
That's many people do that. Others use sarcasm.
Yes.
We all have those little defense mechanisms to get us through the day. So how did you publish?
Yes.
I'm sorry.
So yes, I'll actually answer your question. So I'm published by She Writes Press, and it's
I know She Writes.
Yeah, it's a great publisher. It's a hybrid press. So it's really a hybrid. It's a cross between self-publishing, and in self-publishing, you do everything yourself. Yeah. You get it printed, the layout, the cover, the process of getting it printed, just everything. And in traditional publishing, the publisher basically does everything. And I know there's some authors who feel like they wish they'd had a little more control because the traditional publisher does all the work. But a hybrid publisher is somewhere in between. Mm-hmm. Your hybrid publisher, for example, with me, they don't. It's a selective process. They choose their authors. They don't publish every manuscript. I had to invest some money into it, but they, on their end for that, they did the cover, the copy edit, the proofreading, making sure it's a manuscript that's professional and so forth.
You can have them do just about everything. I mean, there are some organizations that will ghostwrite the book for you.
Right.
So I mean, I'm laughing, but it's true. So we have about 2 minutes left. Are you planning another book?
Well, interesting, I realize I didn't plan this book, so I'm a little hesitant to plan anything. I'm kind of waiting for the inspiration. I do have some ideas that I'm mulling over. I do sort of want to feel finished with this book so I can throw myself into something else. Right now, part of me will always be, will at this point be focusing on the book, still in the marketing and the promoting, but I might explore a different genre, something like historical fiction for a change, get away from myself.
Yeah, no,
for
I
5
understand.
minutes.
I understand. And what are you doing about marketing besides my show?
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity. I did have hired a PR person in the beginning, and that was very helpful. I also have done marketing, and she helped with some marketing, getting onto book tours and so forth,
Right. Blog tours.
and podcasts, blog tours exactly, and podcasts and press and so forth. But also the actual marketing, I'm fine. Everyone's saying, and I'm finding that I hate to say it, but Amazon ads are now sort of very. I think people are doing well with those. So, working on some Amazon ads in terms of marketing and
you could do a
Facebook
newsletter.
Ads. Yes, and yes, exactly.
Sort
newsletter,
of like a
email
blog
list.
newsletter.
Yes, a lot of people are doing that, and that's very helpful. And if there are any writers out there working, getting their book out there, definitely building the email list and those newsletters are very helpful.
It's a lot of work.
Yeah, it's a lot of work.
I wish you all the luck in the world. It's a wonderful story. It's a great read. And thank you for being on the show.
Oh, thanks for having me. I've enjoyed the conversation.
Good. I'm glad.